Welcome to episode 3 of the Acknowledge to Action podcast. I'm your host, Matthew Benko. In this episode, we discuss the importance of adapting to deployments, understanding family dynamics, and embracing change. Lieutenant Colonel Jeffrey Cretz, aka Cretzy, shares his incredible journey of navigating his military career, initially serving on active duty, followed by his transition to the Air National Guard. He currently has 20 and a half years in, and in some ways it feels like he is just getting warmed up. Please note, the opinions expressed in this podcast are solely those of the individuals involved and do not necessarily reflect the views, policies, or positions of the Department of Defense, the United States government, or any other entity mentioned or affiliated. Listeners are encouraged to critically evaluate all information presented and form their own informed opinions. Thank you for joining us here on the Acknowledge to Action podcast, where we embrace the journey. Welcome to episode 3 of the Acknowledge to Action podcast. I'm here with Lieutenant Colonel Jeffrey Cretz, and I'm really excited to get episode 3 going here. Since we're out of uniform, I'm going to go with Cretzy. Hey, Cretzy, thank you so much for being here. I'm really excited for our conversation and hearing your journey.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Matt. I appreciate you inviting me on, and I'm looking forward to the dialogue and talking about some of these very important issues that our service members are facing.
Oh, absolutely. And I know we talked a little bit before we hit the record button, before we went hot, and here, what this podcast represents is embracing the journey, right? So we're really excited to hear your journey and how the steps and the resiliency that you've experienced and that you demonstrated, because you got a lot of great years to, you had a lot of great years of your military service. So there's amazing stories behind there too, but also too, a really important takeaway of the podcast is the significance of acknowledge to action and how that mindset and that model can help us along those journeys. So with that said, please share us your military experience and your journey and how it got to where you are today.
Sure. No, thanks. So both my parents were in the Department of State. So I grew up mainly overseas, countries in the Middle East, Southwest Asia, and then the Far East. So at each of the embassies we would go to, there was a small contingent of United States Marines that were part of what was called the Marine Security Guard Detachment. So at each of these embassies and diplomatic posts, this small group of Marines that were specially trained were there essentially to provide security of all embassy facilities, classified material, and then they would secure embassy events. And so at each of these posts, just watching my parents interact with them, I started to develop friendships. And it kind of, as I got older, they became deeper. And that was really my first interest into the military lifestyle. When I was a senior in high school growing up in China, there was an Air Force officer, a colonel at the time, who worked with my dad, who was the defense attaché in Beijing. And I just remember talking with him about some of his experiences. He was an F-15 pilot. And it just that drove me towards the Air Force as a potential career option. So I graduated from high school from China, the International School of Beijing, started my undergrad experience at James Madison University. And then as I became a junior and into my senior year, began going through the application process for officer training school with the Air Force. Got selected and began OTS shortly after graduating from college in 2003. After OTS, I went to Joint Specialized Undergraduate Navigator training at Randolph Air Force Base, Texas, and then received my first aircraft choice, which was the EC-130 Compass Call in Tucson, Arizona. Moved to Tucson, completed some of the various trainings, water survival school, wilderness survival, or it was called combat survival training, and then some C-130 initial training at Little Rock Air Force Base. Deployed shortly after arriving in Tucson. And funny, that year, the Air Force was overmanning in my career field, even as a lieutenant. So we were all told that we would be facing a force shaping board, I believe, the next year. So a lot of us new lieutenants who didn't have much of a military resume, some of us were very nervous about, hey, does that mean this is the end of our military career? So at that point, I began looking at reserve units just in case, if I met this board, that could be lead to a separation. Luckily, I picked a unit before the board ever happened, and then I moved across country to Pope Air Force Base, North Carolina, flying the C-130 Slick Hercules. So I was at that
Okay.
unit for about 4 years. I was living first as a traditional reservist there in North Carolina, ended up then receiving orders to the Pentagon on the air staff, and I was commuting back and forth between DC and North Carolina. Again, deployed with that unit, and then began my civilian career as a management consultant, working for two different consulting companies in the DC area at an intel community agency. Shortly thereafter, I interviewed with my current unit in the Delaware Air National Guard, and I've been with this unit since 2011.
Okay.
During that period, I was a traditional drill status guardsman. I've been on a Title 10 stat tour in Washington, D.C., working at the Air National Guard Readiness Center, both as the C-130 Functional Area Manager and then also as an executive officer for the Director of the Air National Guard. And I've been back at my unit in Delaware for about 6.5 years as an AGR, serving as Wing Chief of Safety, serving in our Standards and Evaluations office, and then as the Director of Operations for the Airlift Squadron, and my current position as the Commander of the Operations Support Squadron. And I've also had numerous deployments. This last one was as a crew member on a C-130 aircrew, and then the final 2 months as the commanding officer of an expeditionary airlift squadron in 2021. So that's really the rundown of my career. I'm happy to answer any further questions, or if you'd like to dive into any of those specific assignments, I'm happy to.
No, that's great. Wow. Just taking all that in is pretty awesome to hear. So you went the active duty route. Here you went to high school in China. So your father was an overseas diplomat, right? What was his official position or
So
title?
he was a career status diplomat. So if you look at our ambassadors, there's a good mix between some that are politically appointed by the president, and then there's a good batch of them that kind of rise up through the ranks. So he joined the Foreign Service in 1981 and served until 2015. He was under the category of what's called the political officer. So he did a lot of reporting based on his contacts within foreign governments, and would then report back to the folks in the State Department and in other branches of government to help formulate U.S. policy. So,
Wow.
And he was a two-time ambassador for his last two assignments in the Foreign Service.
Wow. So that took the family around that. So you had a lot of life experiences even prior to joining the service, because some folks don't experience anything remotely like that until they join the service. But here you have that, so it kind of paved the way for you, and you had that experience of like, okay, um, I want to pursue an Air Force career, and then it led you to getting your bachelor's degree and the OTS. So is OTS kind of at boot camp basic training?
Yeah. So
for the officer world.
And I just want to piggyback one more thing on what you said about my dad. So the joke was when, I decided I was going to track to a military career, he always made the joke that you guys in the military only go and do your jobs when we fail at doing our jobs on the diplomatic route. So that was always kind of a running joke between diplomacy and then sometimes needing to use the military to achieve objectives. But your question about OTS, I believe each branch has a similar version of it. At the time, ours was 13 weeks. And it's pretty much the officer version of boot camp or basic military training, where they kind of take you as a civilian, and then they kind of start the process to mold you into a military member. So I believe there are definitely some similarities between TS and then BMT or boot camp.
I got you. Yeah, because I heard the acronyms like ROTC, OTS, and then the various forms of academies, right? So you went through OTS, and then you went to the active duty route. So how many years were you active duty before?
So I was active duty just over 4 years.
Well, okay. So and then I don't know how it worked. I mean, I know those circumstances, prompted you to pursue and talk about the significance of power. You acknowledge like,
okay, I need to consider something here. And so I'm not forced into a decision or
That's right.
into, um, I see. And because I know there's different versions, there's like Palace Chase and Palace Friend that you go from active duty into the guardrail.
Sure.
So,
So mine was, I
it's
believe it was called at the time Palace Front, which,
Palace, okay, so it was called that.
yeah, so that means when I joined the Air Force Reserves, I just owed the balance of my commitment in the reserve component. Now I've been here, going over 20 years, so either way, I've met my commitment, I believe.
Yeah, just a little bit, So you went active duty reserves and then to the guard unit. So, in full disclosure, I'm with you there with the Delaware National Guard. So, this is really good to pull back some of the layers and hear these experiences that you had. And you were at the Pentagon, and then you're at the Guard Bureau, and at the Readiness Reserve Center. So that's really cool because the conversation we're gonna kind of just touch upon is the dynamics of deployments, right? We how many deployments do you have all in total?
So I've had 6 deployments to the Central Command Area of Responsibility, and then tackled that with numerous exercises across the globe, anywhere from South America to Europe into the Pacific region.
Yeah, so that goes well beyond one of the motivators for me to kind of shed light on the National Guard and Reserve Forces is just how much we do. It's not your one, it's a generalization. It's not, there's nothing wrong with it, but when we go on 2 weeks out of the year, and it goes, but you and I both know it goes well beyond that. And hearing these stories and hearing these stories and experiences help the outside world, if you will. But that includes friends, family members, and our support. Everyone who supports us is to understand and appreciate a little bit more of what we do, because it's tough to summarize all that we do. I mean, we're going to be talking for about an hour or so, but we could go on for hours just on the last deployment that you were the commander of. So that's just kind of the overall intent of this, is to shed some light on some of the more on the good. It's not all good. It's challenging, all that stuff. So there's a lot of degrees there, a lot of layers of perspective. So I appreciate what you shared already so far, and I'm really looking forward to as we pull back to some of these layers, as far as how how you've managed them, and how you now as a commander, how what that means to you. So, um, I'd like to ask you a question that, can you share with us, your personal journey of balancing your military service, civilian life, right? So for a portion of your guard career in reserve, you did have dual careers, and now you're an AGR, active guard reserve. So you're active duty full time, right? But that has its challenges in and of itself. But can you talk a little bit about, with all the transitions you went through and how you manage them, and how you um you know leverage that to all the mitigating circumstances in your life?
Sure, no, that's no problem. I've got some notes here, Matt. So if you see me glancing down, that's
Yeah,
what I'm looking at.
sure.
So anyone who's been in the Guard or the Reserves, they've heard of this thing called the tripod or the triad of responsibilities, where we have to balance our military careers, our civilian careers, and then our families. If we happen to be a parent or
Mhm.
a spouse or a daughter, you're caring for aging parents. My last boss at the Pentagon, General Rice, used to say there's actually a fourth element of what you have to balance, and that's really yourself. So we've seen cases, and I've probably been there as well, where I'm trying to max perform and do everything I can to balance the other three. And then sometimes there's little left over for yourself. So I always try to, when I speak to folks in the squadron and around, that you got to balance those three, but you also have to take care of yourself. And that could be physically, mentally, picking up and taking care of and enjoying hobbies, spiritually, whatever it is people like to do to kind of unwind and keep that balance. So I'm going to talk specifically about what I tried to do with balancing a military career when I was working for 2 management consulting companies. And the first thing was that I always found was helpful when I interviewed at these places. I always made it very clear and very upfront that I was a member of the Air Force in the reserve component, and that entailed Once a month, I'd be going to a drill weekend. It included flying responsibilities. Sometimes there would be weekend trips. And then sometimes there would be the occasional deployment. And I've deployed twice while working for a civilian company. A lot of the bigger companies are very familiar with the SCRA, which is the Service Member Civil Relief Act, and then USERRA, which is the Uniformed Services Employment and Reemployment Rights Act. So I believe, and I think it's changed over time, but I think those both apply differently based on how big of a company you belong to, what industry. So I would encourage members that are trying to have those discussions with employers, if there are some rights that the member is entitled to. So those are two things. There's a lot of information on the internet. And some companies actually have like a military relations office that helps employees kind of navigate, working for their civilian employer and for the military. So always be honest, and that's being honest with your civilian employer and then also with your military employer or your chain of command. If you have opportunities or travel with your civilian company, I would always make it a habit to make sure my military supervisors were in the know, so they could, they would know when to expect more from me. I'm also very fond of talking about the sine wave of military service. There are some times where you're starting a new civilian job. You have to just be honest with your military employer. Hey, I've just started this new job. It requires training and travel that maybe for the next few months or next few weeks, I've got to dedicate all I can to my civilian company. On the flip side, there are some times when members are at military training or on deployment that they're going to focus more of their efforts, with their military career. And then there are other times where, frankly, right after deployment, a lot of the energy of a military member has to go into kind of recalibrating with family members and just readjusting to life back in the U.S. if they've been deployed. So it's a good thing to be honest, with family members, loved ones, battle buddies, and then employers about where you are on that sine wave curve, and it will change based on situations. I always say it's important to look at forecasting. If you can give an employer, whether that's in the military or on the civilian side, as much as a forward look ahead about what's coming up, your bosses can kind of try to accommodate and figure out how do we manage with an employee being gone or with a military member away at training. I also realize that with the Guard and Reserve is that it's a part-time career, but we do expect, it's almost, we expect full-time standards. For a traditional status guardsman, it could be as little as 24 days during drill weekends and 15 days of annual training, but they are required to maintain standards 365 days a year. And as you and I both know, even in our unit, when things right after the attacks in Israel, there were a lot of folks that were called up to support those efforts, and those folks may have been very engaged in their civilian career, but they start getting phone calls from a military boss saying, "Hey, when can you be ready? We've been asked to supply forces or air crews or whatever the specialty is, and we need folks to be ready. Whether that's in physical conditioning, to have all their training current, to be ready medically." So we definitely expect a lot out of our military members, and it's important that they share sometimes those expectations with the civilian employer. And I know we at the unit do a lot. We have letters that we can send back to the employee to provide to an employer about, the member is coming up on a military duty. Here are the dates that we're hoping to have them at the unit or to go on an exercise. And we do try to keep up relations with these civilian employers. I know some units like ours, we have programs that we try to invite civilian employers to the base. We have what's called the boss lift that we had last year, where members of the military could nominate a civilian boss. We'd go through a process, and then we ended up taking the military member and their civilian boss on a C-130 flight. And it gives just that little token of appreciation to a civilian boss saying, now I get it. Now I understand what what my military member is doing and how much training is required. I know there's
and all that goes into it. All that goes into it. It's like, wow. Like, I think we flew along the coastline of Virginia and Delaware, and all that, and it's that was a great collaborative, public affairs, event, because it builds, building relationships is so important. You're touching upon a lot of great things. And for young men and women who are just entering, say, the Guard and the reserves, that takes practice. That takes, reps to get that communication down. But having an awareness piece you hear me say a lot, like the access point to get access to those tools, to then leverage them to communicate, because you're not going to get it right the first time. It's challenging, it's overwhelming, all those things. So you're touching upon a lot of great points, because you and I are pretty seasoned at this, so it's very easy to reflect on share. But we're at a point in our careers where we empower those who are up and coming, who are soon going to be, in our shoes in the coming years. So I just wanted to acknowledge that. The power of acknowledgement, as we know in our operational checklist as flyers, acknowledge is, if not the most important word that we say, because if you don't acknowledge, you shouldn't do anything, nor can you do it. Maybe I'm saying that backwards, but nor can you, nor should you, if you don't acknowledge. It's a critical thing. And going back to your piece, as far as like I like that fourth pillar, if you will, taking care of yourself. You got to acknowledge what's going on within. Acknowledge, hey, I'm overwhelmed, or even if you just start with that, then you could open up the doors of opportunity present itself. Then that dialogue happens. So, yeah, I just wanted to just highlight that as I'm taking all this in. It's really good stuff.
Yeah, and then just some other things, Matt, that I wanted to add about managing dual careers, as you asked, is that as a supervisor, and if there's civilian employers that are out there, I would just ask, in addition to military supervisors, that we really have to be understanding that life conditions change for people. And I know you're probably in a perfect place to share that. Hey, sometimes life just throws a curveball, or throws something that was unexpected. And so with the squadron I command right now, it's a good mix between full timers that I see every day, and then I have a good mix of folks that I may only see for 2 days a month. And at any one time, folks have got things going on. There could be issues with relationships, with kids, with legal issues, mental health. I mean, I've seen pretty much all of it, and I always remember to step back and realize that I also don't know everything that's going on, and we don't know everything that's going on with the people that we fly with, that we work with. So I always try to keep in mind that these folks are, that everyone's got a story, and everyone's potentially got something going on in the background, and I always try to be sensitive of that.
No, that's great. And as I'm hearing all this, and I'm processing it, because the whole acknowledge the action process, the in between components. I like to acknowledge, accept, process, plan, action. And I think when we take pause and like you said, inventory those things and identify those things, we could start that process, to just kind of acknowledge it from within and share. So then we can help each other, because I know, we're all here to help each other, but sometimes it's tough to ask for help because you don't know how or why, because it is overwhelming. Like, you have 6 deployments. I have that as well. I always joke, like, I'm one more and I'll have as many Super Bowl rings as Tom Brady, rings for his thing, so,
Right.
and sometimes that gets almost lost in translation as far as those experiences, and it's like, man, I got to count on both hands now how many deployments, and
Sure.
it's tough to not I shouldn't say compartmentalize, but kind of like reflect on those, and yeah, it helps us get a little bit better for when, not if, but when the next engagement happens. But it's still it's never it's never easy, but it does become more manageable when you take a step back and like you said, inventory. And the last piece I'll say is, what are the takeaways? MEPS for all of us, like MEPS, when we first heard that, the military entering processing station. The new MEPS for me, for maintenance, is mental, emotional, physical, and spiritual well-being, right? So I've over the years, we love our acronyms in the military, right? And it just helps us, put things in a nice little presentable package for us to remember. But what you're touching upon is just that we have to MEPS has to take on a new meaning in our world.
Sure.
I think if we focus on that mental piece, the emotional piece, the physical piece, and the spiritual, it doesn't make things easier, but when those challenges do present themselves and to manage, because it is manageable to have a guard reserve career and with the right pieces, but it takes work, it takes commitment, it takes sacrifice, it takes dedication, it takes being vulnerable at times and just putting ourselves out there. So I'm sharing that because everything you're saying is touching upon those things, and if I'm thinking, I know a lot of others have experience in thinking that as well.
And if I can add just one more thing, you touched on mental health, and I think I'd be remiss if I don't just share some thoughts on this real quickly because I know how important it can be. Is that I remember growing, when I first joined the military, I really can't remember if we had what was called a mental health office or if we had a director of psychological health. So we've really made a lot of great strides in this area. I know. Whether it was true or not, 20 years ago, the thought was, at least amongst young 20-year-olds like me, was if you have you go seek counseling, you're going to have your security clearance pulled. You're not going to be able to do X, Y, or Z. That may or may not have been true. I can't remember, but I now know, 20 years later, is that we've really tried to, let the force know and let families know that it's okay to seek help. And when I was at the Pentagon back in 2008 or so, I was working for an Army general. His name was Gary Patton, who he had recently deployed. I think he'd seen some combat. I think he was a Purple Heart recipient. And I remember it was either during a congressional testimony or he had written an op-ed. I don't remember exactly, but he was at the time one of the first general officers who was very vocal about receiving mental health counseling and how it has not impacted negatively his military career. And that started, he was one of the first folks that I remember trying to tell folks, hey, it's okay to seek help. And then just a few years ago, our four-star commander of Air Mobility Command, General Minahan, I believe it was on an Instagram post or Twitter, where he actually took a screenshot of his daily calendar. And right in the middle of the day, on a work day, was a 2-hour block for his mental health appointment that he had set up. And I think what he was trying to encourage the folks in his organization was, I'm the four-star general in charge of countless number of airmen, airplanes, missions, etc. And even I need to sometimes take a step back and go seek help. So it kind of shows that the stigma isn't what it used to be. And I think this is a great thing for the military that we've kind of acknowledged that, people are at their best when they're able to acknowledge, as you say, that they've got some issues that they're working through, and it's okay to seek help from a professional.
That's so well stated. And because I've been in long enough, I've seen a lot of shifts in culture and the dynamic. And you're absolutely spot on. Like I can't go back in time and say if I were taught mental health, or to maintain, mental fitness. Sometimes when we switch words a little bit, it's like health and fitness, it could change the dynamic of how we approach things, right? I want to be mentally fit. Okay, because we talk about being physically fit. It's like, yeah, go hit the gym, let's get our CrossFit on. But no, it's true. But like, you got to do the same thing. Got to put in the work for
Sure.
the emotional piece of that. And yeah, we are in progress. You're talking about checklists now. We have a really good checklist that's open now, I believe, in my opinion, in the Guard, Reserve, and in the military culture as a whole, to say, look, it's okay. And that's why, like, in fact, I know for me, that it's a little vulnerable because you're going into arguably uncharted territory to a certain extent. But it's important because it goes back to your point saying, well, I got to take care of myself, because if I don't take care of this, it's going to take care of me, maybe in less than favorable ways, well, we're touching on a lot of good stuff. I know when we talked before the podcast, like I was like, oh, we're going to specifically talk about, but no, this just shows how dynamic the life and the journey of service members are, regardless of active duty, Guard, Reserves, and all that. So yeah, wow, no, thanks for sharing that, because it just reinforces, because as leaders now, we have to know the way, show the way, and go the way, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
When I went to NCO Academy, they go, how do you define a leader? I remember seeing that somewhere. I might be a John Maxwell quote. I'm not claiming that as my own quote by any means, but I read it and it just stuck with me. And by you saying that and by seeing your leaders demonstrating that, they know the way, they're showing the way, and they're actually going the way. And it paves the way. And that change that's a culture that I that our young folks can gravitate towards,
100% agree.
So we're reflecting because I would like to hear, because you're putting out such good information here and sharing a little bit of your background and sharing what it means to be a leader in the Air Force. I'd like to ask you, how your experience went with the last deployment, because when you say 2021, I was there, so I was a little, I was behind the curtains with you, so I pull back the layers. But we were there at a pretty critical time in 2021. On the first half of the deployment, you were a crew member, and if you could talk a little bit about what it is, maybe we could talk about the dynamic of a C-130 crew. Like, what does a navigator do? And you as a rated officer, how does that with that? But then we could talk about that deployment, how you went from being a crew member, and then you had a transition, because I was in similar positions in deployment prior to that. You go from crew member to being a leader. In my case, it was a superintendent. In your case, it was a commander position. That's not an easy thing to do, So if you could just talk a little bit about that and how the acknowledge, accept, process, plan, and action process, it may have helped you with that, or you were doing it. And yeah.
Sure. So to your first question about different positions on a C-130 crew, obviously a standard C-130 crew, at least on the H model that our unit flies, is 6 members. We have an aircraft commander who's overall responsible for the mission, the crew, and then the aircraft. You have a co-pilot who assists the pilot with piloting duties. You have a flight engineer who's an enlisted member who is the systems expert on the airplane. That they're really the PhD level of all the intricacies of the aircraft. They run a lot of what we call toll data, takeoff and landing data. And then they have a wealth of they run a lot of the checklists. And then they're pretty much if there's an emergency on board, they're the ones who kind of will help the crew diagnose and then make recommendations to the aircraft commander, who's the ultimate authority. As the navigator, I'm responsible for obviously getting the crew from point A to point B safely, effectively, and on time. The navigator also has a big job when it comes to airdropping, whether it's personnel, equipment. And then there's a lot of mission planning that the navigator is really considered the expert for. Load masters are 2 of our, which you are one. So if I say anything incorrect, please correct it for me. But 2 members, usually they're enlisted, and they're really in charge of the 80% of the aircraft, pretty much behind the flight deck, and they're responsible for safe loading and unloading of cargo, ensuring that personnel receive needed briefings in the back. And then they're really they do a lot of the point discussions with ground handling and ground personnel to make sure that the aircraft is configured properly and that everything gets on and off the airplane safely and at the right location. So that's the standard C-130 crew. So I'll pause there if you have any comments.
No, it just adds a good just overall perspective, because that in and of itself, like Air Force, I'll generalize here. Air Force as a whole, like I'll speak from an aviator perspective. We put, as we have to, so much training behind, as you talked about earlier when we got started, just how much, like, as a guard and reservist, like, we are absolutely held to a full-time standard. Like, we have to maintain, not only attain but maintain active duty full-time standards. And for the majority of our forces in the guard reserves, it's the traditional force. So we're doing that on a part-time resources. When I say resources, time, and it's challenging and necessary. But I asked that question because it just adds, like, wow, how is a guard reservist we do it. We figure out a way. We acknowledge it. We're in the business of figuring. When somebody asks me, like, what a loadmaster does, or even just, a crew member does. We're in the business of figuring it out and getting it done. That's how. So when I'm working with a new loadmaster deploying for the first time, or like, well, what does a loadmaster do? It's like we figure it out and we get it done because there's just so much involved. And yeah, we have a general plan to get the mission done, but we are really seasoned experts on adjusting to change and adjusting to those changes. And I think that absolutely correlates to, or helps deal with, so some of our behind the scenes stuff that are more personal. So I I asked that because that's what you did on the first half of the crew, right? You're a crew dog, like we like to call it, right? And then you go into the leadership as a commander in a deployed location, and we're flying combat missions. I mean, we were covering a significant part of the AOR, right? So how did you deal with that transition and change? And please talk about how your training, education, and experience helped you with that transition. And no pun intended, but help you navigate that transition, right?
Sure. So I just want to add one more comment to what we just talked about. So I remember during one of my change of commands, I think out of that assignment, I remember remarking something to the along the lines of that there are a few things more beautiful on this earth than a C-130 crew somewhere out in this, we call it the system, that has thrown some challenges, whether it's a foreign language issue or a customs issue, or trying to determine if we can accept certain cargo, or to figure out a maintenance issue and who do we call and who's the approval authority to approve a certain maintenance action. But there are a few things that are more beautiful, to me at least, than watching a crew just kind of go out there with just the six of them. Sometimes there's a crew chief, one of our maintainers, and just giving them a problem set and then them figuring it out and then getting back safely. So just wanted to add that it's pretty awesome to watch security crews go out and kind of do their business. And sometimes, there may not be cell phone service. There may not be, a way to email back to someone at a command center or at at another base. And they just really got to figure it out. And they got to use all that experience that hopefully they've received over previous deployments, training at home, exercises, to then make the best decision and then kind of move out. So as far as your question about transitioning from a crew member into the deployed squadron command. So with this specific deployment, we had known somewhere 12 or 18 months before when we would be going and who we'd be going with. As you remember, we were paired up with the Reserve Airlift Wing out of Maxwell Air Force Base in Alabama. So immediately when we started trying to figure out, who's going to be on which crew, who's going to fill which position, and I was lucky to have been selected to be the second half deployed squadron commander, I immediately started building relationships with our sister unit at the time. It was the first time we deployed with them. And then just a few months prior to the deployment, we sent somewhere between 20 and 30 folks down there for a week. And we would fly with their unit and we'd meet a lot of their folks. So we started building that connective tissue. So I was at that point, had developed a very good working relationship with the first half squadron commander. So being there in country for the first 2 months, him and I were in contact almost daily about the things that he was working on, some of the challenges. So it actually worked out, I think, to my benefit, that when I stepped into the new position, I had been there for the last 2 months and had been in near daily contact with him. So I almost like you hit the ground running. But it's definitely it was a lot to take in, that when you accept the guide on during a change of command, and you say to the group commander that, sir, I assume command, that at that point, as ceremonial as the moment was, it's everything is everything that happens from that in that squadron for the next 2 months or so was ultimately my responsibility. So I didn't take that lightly. Luckily, Matt, I had a great cast of director of operations, senior enlisted leaders, first sergeants, and then we really had some great aircraft commanders, maintainers, and just other support folks that really helped us carry our mission. I don't have the metrics in front of us, but it was something along the lines of, for those 4 months, I think it was 3,600 combat hours. We had moved 10 million pounds, 15,000 passengers. And then what I'm most...
There was a lot. I was busy.
Yeah. And then what I'm most proud of is the combat airdrops. We had crews from both units that had resupplied forward operating bases, both in Jordan and in Syria, at what was a pretty pivotal time during that deployment.
Yeah.
And you hit on real briefly Operation Allies Refuge. That happened during our first step, and one of the funny stories personally was my crew we'd been on an all-day mission out to Lebanon that day. No cell phone service, no texts. So we got back after it seemed like a 14 or 15-hour day, and we get back on our crew van and we're going to the dorms or going to eat dinner or whatever it was, and we made a joke or asked a question to the driver. Hey, so did anything happen today? And it just happened to be that day was the day that the Taliban happened to enter the presidential palace in Kabul in Afghanistan, and it kind of taken over the country. So in a span of hours, literally the region had changed. And then the next 2 weeks was one of the largest non-combatant evacuation operations, I think, in history. You'll have to check on that. And I know some of our crews, including ours, did get to transport refugees from one location to another to get them ready for travel either to Europe or the United States or elsewhere around the world. So that was there was a lot of emotions at the time, especially for folks that had been deployed in Afghanistan, realizing that was all that work and all those months away from home, was it worth it? That was going through our minds, but kind of accept it, acknowledge it, and then we were getting ready to go support any movements that were required of us.
Yeah, I that's an experience that will forever be a part of me, obviously, and you, and I think it's going to take. Well, I can only say for myself personally, it's going to take years to pull back those layers and just fully, acknowledge those thoughts, those feelings that come with that. Because, I've deployed to Afghanistan, years prior to that, and then seeing it, and then being part of the air crews to get I'll say the residual airlift, because we were where we were at was too far to get to Bagram, right? And all that stuff. It was just the nature of logistics, right? So then, but the C-17s would hand off to us, and we were at all the bases where we were at, where we were dealing combat stuff. We were dealing with, like, since civilian affairs as well, and it was a very, very unique experience that I don't think anybody could have anticipated or planned for prior. Because you talked about, like, the objectives, like, we got with our sister unit, we're going to have those dialogues, and we're going to build that relationship and that rapport, and that's normal, right? And that's good, and all that stuff. But I think one of the things is, like, well, we're going there, we're going to do our 4-month deployment, and I hate saying that because I know Army and other ones, but it's just the nature of it's more of an aircraft thing. It's not a personnel thing, but how we got to root it out. But you always have to expect the unexpected when it comes to any sort of operations in the military. But as I just want to acknowledge, like, you went from being on a crew, and then you front loaded all that, you did all the preparation work to that objectively and administratively enter that position. How was it for you personally to go from being a crew dog? As we were flying almost every other, because we were incredibly busy over there, even before the withdrawal from Byron, when we were dealing with all that. So how did you deal with that, being in a room? I forget what our room conditions were. Was it 3? We were doing 3 per room. Yeah. So it's fun that there's a lot of, it's really awesome being a crew dog and all that stuff. But then that transition happened. It's a 180 in my experience. And so if you can talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So obviously I had a great crew on the first tab. We had a lot of fun. We definitely had some long days. We had some days that went up to almost 18 hours from when we got a phone call or got on a bus to go start a day. To then get back to our rooms. So there's definitely some stressful moments, and sometimes people can wear on each other. But at the end of the day, we were a pretty close crew. In my opinion, we had a lot of inside jokes. We had a lot of laughs, but we also knew that when it was time to get down to business, we got down to business. And then to your question about you transition to a command position, and you're right. I don't think it's necessarily a good or a bad change. It's just you're just looked at differently. They put you in another building. with other, lieutenant colonels and leaders, and you're almost kind of put aside from, the two main dorms where the, everyone else lived. Luckily, I had my DO at the time was someone I had known going back 10 years at that point. So I had someone who knew me before, this position, and we used to we would almost get breakfast every morning. He'd get to work a little bit earlier than I would. He'd cover the early hours, and I would usually stay later. But that was usually our 30 minutes where the two of us would go to the chow hall together. And really, we talked a little bit about work, but it was a lot about family and kind of what we were going through. And just in that transition, you go from really just worrying about your crew almost and yourself to now you're worrying about 107 other people essentially. So I wrote a quick list of some of the things I remembered being aware of and trying to help with. Is we had folks that were dealing with financial issues. We had some folks that were dealing with legal and custody issues back home with the former spouse. We had some folks that had issues with a marriage or with the engagement. We had someone who had a death of a family member, and we had to help work through the chain of command and the processes to get that member home. For those events. We had folks definitely had some mental health challenges. A few panic attacks where you get a phone call, at an odd hour of the night, pretty much, from the clinic, and that's where you put on some clothes and you go and you take care of the member. Luckily, I had a really strong support team. We had an amazing first sergeant. And for those who don't know, the first sergeant is it's usually a very experienced senior enlisted leader who has a lot of contacts throughout the base with the chaplain and the medical service, and then all the support agencies. So I had a very experienced first sergeant. We had chaplains available to us, directors of psychological health or mental health counselors. And then we had our own flight doc there. So I was very quick to bring in members of the team to help me navigate these issues, because sometimes they're very simple to deal with. Sometimes it could just be as easy as, hey, this person needs to sit out for a day or two to take care of some issues. Or sometimes it takes several people to arrange for a flight to get someone home as soon as possible to attend to family issues. So that's one thing I learned about, that it's you have to rely on the experts. And don't be afraid to ask for help.
That's great, and that's a great segue into kind of a foundation question here. That kind of the intent is kind of like summarize everything we talked about today, right? Your personal experience, in the military, how it equipped you to go on to become a commander and to empower those around you and to support. And because it's the nature of what we do, it's not a matter if, it's a matter of when. I tell, I'll share something here. When I got family members and even some friends like, man, haven't you deployed enough and XYZ? I was like, that's not how this works. It's like being a firefighter, and you would have to be ready to put out the fires, right? Yeah, it's nice when there's a little bit of a break and you don't have, but that's just the nature. Like, you just can't pick and choose when you feel like putting out a fire. Like, we always answer the call, and that's what I'm really proud of, with being in just Air Force in general, but especially with the Guard, because there's a different degree, and I want to emphasize there's a different degrees of challenge. Doesn't make them any different or more intense in active duty and all that stuff, but there's a different set of degrees that we kind of we're forced to acknowledge to get through, to manage this. So with that said, what are some practical coping mechanisms or tools that military families can utilize to manage the emotional toll of deployments on both the deployed member and their loved ones back home?
No, that's a great question. And luckily you kind of told me this is something we would hit on, so I did jot down some notes. So I will just say that of my 6 deployments, the first 2, I was not married, didn't have kids. The second 2 deployments, I was married, and then the last 2 deployments, I had 2 kids. So right now, my girls are almost 10 and 7. So this go back a few years, so they're a bit younger. So just a few things that, and my wife and I talked about these. So if you want to stop me at any point for more clarity, just let me know. But one was that we, as much as they can understand, that you don't surprise them with it. So if a few months out, at some point you start talking to them about it. Hey, dad or mom's got to go away, for their job. They've got to go to a different part of the world. And I remember we would start pointing at the map just to give them some idea of what does that mean, around the world? So we'd say, hey, here's Delaware where we live right now. And I'm going to be going over to this area over here. We would talk about time zones, about how it could be morning, where they are, but it could be evening where a parent is. So at least so they're not surprised that why is daddy, why is it dark outside when it's, light out here? Um, my wife used to, she would spray my cologne on one of their stuffed animals. So they each, when they went to bed, they'd have that. And it was, believe it or not, it was a very comforting that they could, they knew what I smelled like. And then they'd have that as kind of a security item for them. I also realized that even though as a deployed family member, there'd be times I'd get back from a long mission. And the first thing you'd want to do is you want to FaceTime or you want to call home and talk to the family, see how the kids are doing. But I also had to remember that their life, all their lives go on without us. Usually the first few days and first few weeks are very challenging for some families, but eventually they figure it out. And so I talked to my wife and say, hey, is this now a good time? And if they were in the middle of playing with friends, or if they were in the middle of an activity, I was always trying to be sensitive, not to just, startle them and kind of cause chaos in their lives just because it was convenient for me. So I was always sensitive to that. I know some members would have, I guess there's websites where you can have a stuffed animal, with a picture of a deployed family member, or you can have a pillowcase made with a picture of a family member. And some families that works for them. Another thing that we thought about was I created what's called a chain link. Is that, I predicted I'd be gone for about 140 days. And I had written a message on a piece of construction paper for every single day I was going to be gone. And it helped show them to understand time. It's very tough. You can explain to a younger kid, Dad's gone for a day or two. It's a lot tougher to explain what 140 days is.
Yeah.
So I write a message every day, and someone would be very simple, like, hey, Daddy's thinking about you today. Have a great day. Some of them would be, hey, you guys are doing really good in school. How about go to McDonald's today for lunch? And so I had 140 that we would staple together, and each day, either in the morning or at night, they would open one. And then they would then start to see the chain link go from 140 to 130.
Oh, wow.
So obviously there might be some parents, or there might be some situations where, well, mom and dad is going to be gone for over a year. That might be really tough to process. So I only offer these suggestions as things that work for our family. They may not work for every family. I always would bring home a stuffed animal for each of them for the last 2 deployments, and it's stuffed animals that they still keep in their rooms, and it brings them back to dad or mom or whoever will come back. And that was something that we tried to keep going. I'll also say that there's still going to be challenges at home for the family. So I always tried to make sure that I had folks in my military unit would check in on the family. Just hey, do you need help with an appliance, or whatever the issue was around the house? And we were very fortunate to have a really strong support network in our neighborhood. So we had 5 or 6 families that were very close with my family that really kind of looked in on them. Would offer to watch the kids if my wife needed a break. Or need to go out and do some errands, or just needed a night out. So, so I was also, whenever these issues would come up, there's a time to try to fix an issue. And then there are sometimes that, a kid or a spouse wants you just to listen. And as you say, just to acknowledge it and just to be supportive. So I'm very much a doer. I like to get at the heart of an issue and fix it, but sometimes there's really nothing you can do. When you're 7 time zones away and 8,000 miles away, sometimes they need an outlet to vent or to get something off their chest.
Oh, absolutely. We all need our options and access points to process, and that sometimes that just means internal reflection, even for small kids. Even regardless of what age we are. So those are some really good coping, strategies to deal with that.
And I got a few more, Matt. Just looking at my list. One thing I know is never promise a return date. I know the military will usually do everything they can to if they say we're going to get a unit home on a certain date, we're going to try. But life happens, there's weather, maintenance issues. Sometimes a unit that's replacing you is late getting into theater. So I always tried to say, hey, until I call you when I'm on my last leg, getting home, don't circle a date on a calendar, because that would be you would hate to add to any more emotional turmoil to have kids, excited that you're coming home on a specific day, and now you're delayed by, a day or two or a week. Yeah, and right now I'll just say that I have right now 2 members of our squadron are deployed overseas, and I make it as a commander and someone who actually cares about them deeply. I check in with them at least once a week. How are they doing? Their roles over there. How are they doing themselves? And then I ask about the families. And sometimes there are things that they may ask. Hey, can you check in on this? And sometimes they're just glad that, hey, someone from around the world is checking in on me. And wants to make sure that I'm doing okay. So that's something I would offer to any military member. If you've got folks that are deployed right now, just please keep checking in on them and seeing what they need.
That's great. It's amazing what one small text could do. We're called in an acknowledgement text, like, hey, how's it going? Hey, great. Thanks for asking. There's a world of wonders, even outside of a deployed environment, even just, going back to helping an individual if they're going through an emotional, low point. So that's really great. I can't thank you enough, Lieutenant Colonel Jeffrey Cretz. This has been great because it just talking about having an opportunity to process a little bit, personally, and to share with the world and who's out, all who are going to be listening. You're putting a perspective, and for those wearing the uniform, whether it's in the reserve, guard, active duty, but they have some more perspective, aka tools in their toolbox to manage those transitions and all the things, all the challenges that are going to come our way, their way. So I can't thank you enough for just being here today. Your time, sharing your perspectives, sharing your resources. It means a lot.
Do you mind, Matt? And you can go back and edit this out. I had a few more things that while I had a captive audience that I know we had talked about it. If you decide to use this or not, but a few other things. Just about being a leader in a military unit, I think is important, and hopefully you'll second me on this. Is that we ask a lot of our military members, and a lot of military members, if they're in a unit that is a cohesive organization, they're gonna take they're gonna watch how their commanders and leaders act. And I say this because we've got a lot of members in our unit that sometimes have long commutes, for example, and their kids are playing sports, or they have a religious event, or they're in Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, they're acting in a school play, and I always try to, even though we have standards and we have expectations, I always try to, when folks ask, hey, do you mind if I leave early today, to get home for a kid's baseball game, or there's a they're acting in the school play. I would just suggest leaders that to always take those requests in stride, and if the mission can go on, and you can make those exceptions, and if you make it for one person, make it for everybody. But make sure that people know that they're not forbidden, or they're not discouraged from attending those events, as long as they work it through with their supervisor. And I used an example recently that my daughter was going on a field trip to a museum in Philadelphia. It was during a work day, and I had worked out, a different scheduling arrangement with my boss about, hey, I'd like to, attend this field trip. It would mean a lot to me and my daughter. And then I remember at a commander's call after the fact, is that I showed a picture of me, and my daughter at this event, and I made it very clear that, hey, this was during the workday. I had cleared it with my boss, and that it's important that if it's important to me and my family, that I offer it to the members and their families, because I think it's important that we understand that life goes on even when we're doing military duty. And then one thing I thought was important, just you asked earlier about an emotional experience during deployment, and it was towards the end of it where my wife had sent me a video, and it was of one of my daughters. She was facing away from the camera, and she was talking to one of her stuffed animals, and she was really emotional, and she was crying, and she was kind of. It sounds like she was just kind of going over her day. And I asked, Megan, hey, what's going on? And she had told me that, well, this is what happens every day. Sometimes it goes, it's a lot more of a lighter atmosphere. Sometimes it's a heavier atmosphere. And on that specific day, she was pretending that the teddy bear was me, and she was going over everything that happened at her day at school. And it was one of those things that you're 8,000 miles away, and it kind of put in perspective that families have a lot. There's a big burden for families to carry, and that
Yeah.
kind of made it makes it very visceral for you, because you just want to reach through the phone and kind of hug your kid, or and try to make things better. But I've just offered to people that are getting ready to deploy, or that are deployed, that we hear you and we see you, and we know these things are happening, and I hope that family members and the members themselves are aware that there are resources out there if you're struggling through any kinds of these issues.
That's so important. What you said. To share a personal experience, because it puts in perspective of just what we can and need to do for others, and that's a message that will never get. There's some message in the military like, okay, we get it, safety first, and that sort of stuff.
Sure.
It's like, we get it, but that, what you just said, like the core of it all, like, we are absolutely emotional beings, whether we like to accept it or not. Like, as human beings, we are absolutely emotional. It's just how we manage those, and how we inventory that, and how we respond to things versus reacting, and hearing that about your daughter just shows how resilient somebody. Yeah, I'm sure what her age was at the time, but young, young daughter. To that's a reflection of how we empower others and how we support. Because it's one thing to acknowledge; it's a whole other level to support, active, steady, consistent support. So that message is incredibly important and valuable on so many different levels. And to the average listener, I'm just like, okay, yeah, support, I get it. But like, when you constantly reinforce that's where the important stuff happens.
So I'm going to be the guest host for the next question, and I'm going to flip the script on you. And I know you've got kids and a wife, and I'm curious, on our last deployment, what methods that your family used, to battle this deployment, and if you had any emotional moments that maybe were shared with you while you were deployed.
So beforehand, when you were sharing your strategies and techniques you use, there were some very similar ones, but one in particular that I did. So how old was my son at the time? Right around three-ish. A big thing. Our thing at night was Dad reads to Teddy, right? And it just became that I look forward to. And so when I was getting ready to leave, it's like, okay, what can we do to supplement this, to fill that gap that we know is going to be there? Sure. So, you go on Amazon for so many different things. We bought like books that you could record, and then he presses a button. It was a Jack and the Beanstalk, book. We also downloaded an app. I don't know the app off the top of my head, what it was, but you could record yourself to books as well. So I don't know if it was in an app. I think I just recorded like the 4 or 5 books that he liked. Sure. You know how it is as a 3-year-old. We just like the same book multiple times. So I did that, and that was. I remember my wife Jess saying like that really helped her too. Just they hear that voice, so it's not. Yeah, he heard it on occasion through phone calls, and so if I was able to get like a 2-minute call with him before, it's like he's real excited, but then that wears off. Again, as a 3-year-old, they're not going to keep their attention on the phone for a long time. So, but those recorded books were helped, and he still has them, and he actually, now he's going to be 6 year, next month. He still listens, and he still appreciates and values that. That was one thing, and I don't recall a particular emotional moment like when I was over there, like you experienced. There may have. I just don't recall at the moment, but I do recall the emotional, I'll say, exchange we had. Like, he was napping when I came home, so I pretended to nap next to him. And um, hearing his voice, it did something. Like, because I didn't hear his voice in person like that. And we weren't going very long, but it was long enough to be like to know it was impactful. And so I was like, wow, he's like, Daddy, but it was like a different voice, and I don't know if he was overwhelmed with emotion and just seeing him and hearing that, but it was such an experience. And you could have timed it. I mean, he just happened to be, we got home like late afternoon. He happened to be sleeping, and in 15 minutes he woke up naturally, and there I was. And he was just like, is this for real? Yeah. Like, yeah, it's for real, pal. Then we started wrestling, and and it really was fun. So I remember that. And then, when something like that happens, and having those opportunities, all the challenging moments that we experience, almost, I shouldn't say it gets washed away, but like it's like, it's worth it. You know what I mean? Like, it's like, yeah, we made those challenges, we went through a lot of trials and tribulations. Was it all worth it? Once you have those experiences, when you come home, it's like, yeah, it was.
Yeah.
And we all have those, and that's a lot of different things for a lot of different people. For us, we're talking about having on family. For other people, it could be other things. It could be, seeing their mother, father, or, whatever it is that they're used to, getting back to consistency, and planning for that, looking forward to that, but also acknowledging that it may be a little bit different at first. Like I said, the first 2 weeks when you leave are real challenging for the family. So that's we can have a whole nother conversation. What that transition is like when we come back. It's going to take, you can't just insert yourself back in. Okay, back
Sure.
to normal. No, it's a new norm that you have to adapt and adjust to. And
Sure.
I think that's an important piece to kind of, factor into the equation.
It doesn't go right back to the way it was before you left. And like you said, there's a period of reintegration, and some families may be, hey, the next day it's like, no one ever left, but some families, it could be days, weeks, months. And luckily, it sounds like for both of our families, it was a relatively quick adjustment. But I've heard of other stories where, if the kids were, at a certain age, they may not remember a parent deploying, and then they come back, and then that may look different than maybe the reintegrations that you and I have gone through. So I just, it's a little bit different for everyone. And it's you kind of just have to go through the motions sometimes, and you may not know what kind of reintegration it may look like.
No, you're absolutely right. Expect unexpected. I'll say, you know me long enough now to where, like, I like my quote saying, but human behavior is predictably unpredictable. And so is like readjustment and coming back. Like, we can have a general understanding of some of the challenges, but you don't know until you're experiencing that. And to reflect on some of the things you said earlier, just knowing and reaching out when it does get overwhelming, and where you're going to get fatigued and frustrated. I know I've experienced fatigue and frustration on a number of different levels. And sometimes it's overwhelming to, like, identify what you need to do in that moment, other than taking pause, right? But know to, all everyone who's listening, whether you've been in that situation or you're going to be in that situation, know that there's a lot more there's a lot of resources out there. And that could be overwhelming, itself, to identify which one, but just acknowledge that, acknowledge that, and like, all right, I'm going to be all right. I got this. Maybe not in this exact immediate moment, but like, take pause, process it, and then reach out to those. There's a lot of people who care for it. May not seem like that, and you may not want to be like, oh, I'm a burden if I call Lieutenant Colonel Cretz, even though he gave me some, I don't know. No, I am not speaking for you, but I know you're here for me and so many others, and vice versa. So take advantage of that. You utilize that, and don't feel like you're going to be a burden. In fact, just the opposite. If we find out that we could have helped you and make things a little easier, then it's like, man, you should have. All you got to do is ask. Reach out. But that goes to the point of being. It's okay to be vulnerable. We have to be vulnerable to help each other. Offering help and asking for help is a different degrees of vulnerability, which I think we can all do better as a whole to do better with.
And just if I'm struggling or if I have some issues and I reach out to my buddy Matt and let you know what's going on, chances are maybe you're going through the same thing, and then there's that connective tissue that, oh, it's not just me who has this issue. A good friend of mine or someone that I work with is also going through something similar, and then it builds that, okay, well, there's someone else now who kind of sees what I'm dealing with. So yeah, it's tough to be vulnerable, but I think once you're able to do that and you find people that you trust, or you find resources that work for you, I think it just helps balance everything else out, and hopefully people can live better lives when they're able to be vulnerable and share what's going on inside.
No, I'm absolutely. This is great. Colonel Kretz, hey, this has been a pleasure and an honor to have you on here today. I can't state enough how valuable this is and how great this was today. So, our conversation was great, and I know it's going to impact all of our listeners in a really effective way. And on a parting note, I'll say this: I believe, arguably, music is a universal language for all. It helps us in so many different ways, depending on the type of music we're listening to. Sometimes it can get us motivated. Sometimes it can help us decompress. So what we're doing here with the Acknowledge to Action podcast, and to help embrace the journey, is we're building a playlist that's going to be accessible on Spotify, Apple Music, Pandora, all that stuff. So what song would you like to dedicate to this playlist?
Sure. So, but before I give you the musical selections, I just wanted to again say thanks for inviting me. I hope to the folks listening that some of the things I've said resonate with them, and that maybe gives them some coping mechanisms. And it was a pleasure being on your podcast. If there are ever other podcasts with topics that I can help with, I'm always happy to come back on. And for the songs you asked, I'm actually going to give you two, because there's two of them that are
Okay.
very important to me. The first one, by my favorite band Metallica, is the song One, and then the second one is Brothers in Arms by Dire Straits. They both talk about warfare in kind of a different light. So the lyrics are going to mean different things to different people, but they're both songs that I enjoy listening to and that have some meaning to me personally. So thanks for asking.
Well, thanks for sharing your experience, everything you talked about today, and that too. There's two really great, amazing songs: Dire Straits and Metallica, but Dire Straits especially. Mark Knopfler, amazing. That song really hits close to home to me. And if it's hitting this close to home for you and I know it's going to mean a lot to others as well. So I'm really looking forward to getting that playlist out. And now when I listen to it, I'm gonna remember this conversation for a long time. So thank you again.
Thank you.
You're always welcome here. Look forward to co-host with you with an episode in the future. And yeah, so thank you and take care. And till next time.
Till next time.